Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Deepa Sriram, and I'm from the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I'll be your host this evening for our webinar titled Developing International Students' Scholarly Voice in Academic English Writing. And this will be hosted and presented by Basil Considine, Basil, and Jenny Martin. And before we get started and I turn it over to them, I wanted to just go through a few things with you. First of all, I am recording this meeting, and what that means is tomorrow you'll get an email from CFE that has both the PowerPoint presentation, any of the handouts that our presenters will share with you this evening, as well as a recording of this webinar. I'm turning it over to the next slide, which is sort of our housekeeping slide here, and I just wanted to let you know a few things about this webinar. First of all, you see the center screen is highlighted. That is basically where you will see the PowerPoint presentation that our presenters will be using this evening and all the information that they will be discussing. We also have a couple of boxes highlighted here. One is the chat area, and it is at the bottom. And during the presentation, if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share with our presenters, please feel free to go ahead and type that in. And I'm sure that they will get to you as soon as a segue appears. You will also see on the right that we have a captionist. So this information will all be typed up there at the top screen. And you'll see all our presenters, our participants who are attending this evening. We also have a raised hand button at the top of your screen. If you click on that, a drop-down menu will appear. If you'd like to raise your hand rather than type in the chat box, you can go ahead and click on the raise hand. It will show us that you do have a comment that you would like to share. If you came in, you may either be on mute or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question at that point. We also have an attendee here today who is on Skype. So I don't know if the raise hand button will work for you, Craig, but we can certainly try it because I have not had anyone come in on Skype before. And last but not least, yes, I see it, and Craig, you have raised your hand, so perfect. Thank you for showing me. And last but not least, there is a help button at the top right-hand side of your screen, so if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please click on that, and hopefully that will resolve your issues. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jenny Martell, who will begin our webinar. And once again, welcome. And one final note, please know at the very end of the presentation, when I end the webinar, a survey will pop up. We do ask that you wait a moment to have that survey pop up on your screen, and we would really appreciate your feedback on this evening's webinar. So if you would take a moment, it's just a couple of questions, won't take too long. We would appreciate it if you would do that for us. So once again, welcome, and Jenny, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, welcome. I'm Jenny Martell. I'm a dissertation editor with the Writing Center, and we are very happy to have you here today. And just give you a brief overview of our schedule. We will start out talking about writing and writing feedback issues, some different perspectives. It'll take about 10 minutes to discuss some of the intercultural writing issues. And we'll also discuss some institutional data on self-identified student needs. We'll go from there and discuss writing and writing feedback issues. We'll do a couple case studies, so we'll have some good examples there. Then we'll move into recommended strategies, materials, and resources. From there, we'll go again back to writing and writing feedback issues, discuss another case study, and we'll wrap up with a discussion and open it up to you guys, the participants, and we'll talk about some tips and strategies. So the learning outcomes are that the participants will evaluate a set of writing samples and potential responses and be able to share strategies for developing students' scholarly writing voices. And I will now pass it on to my colleague, Basil Considine.
Thank you, Jenny. So my name is Basil Considine. I am both a contributing faculty member with academic skills and also on staff at the Writing Center, where I work with Jenny on helping doctoral students get through the capstone process. When I arrived at Walden University 2.5 years ago, one of my first conversations was with Eric Riddell about improving time to degree. And since then, I have kept an eye out to look at what things faculty report their students getting stuck at, whether it's coursework stage, at the capstone stage, somewhere in the middle, with the process of transitioning into being students, and looking at what the students report back to us as things that they're having trouble with, that they especially appreciate or make use of. And so part of what you're getting today is the perspective that we're bringing from both the faculty and staff sides of things, of looking at the common question of how can we help our students get through their education better, get more out of it. And one of the areas that we've noticed very early on was about developing student scholarly voice. In an online classroom environment especially, a lot of learning predicates on reading and communicating your understanding, your synthesis, your development of ideas through your writing. So we're going to spend most of the session talking about different ways to help make our international students more effective writers. A lot of these things that we're talking about also happen to be very useful for our domestic students as well, who come from a great variety of different backgrounds. But the particular focus and emphasis in this one will be on international students. Now, you get to contribute. I strongly encourage you to ask questions as we go along. The best sessions, I always think, are those that are shaped by both the questions, the hands raised, the needs and desires of the people in the room. So if there's something that you'd like to hear a little bit more about or that you'd like us to clarify, just ask away. You can type away in the chat window. You can raise your hand. There'll be a couple points where we pause to solicit your input. So let's look at where Walden students are. This data comes from about 2 years ago. You can see that, explanation, the yellow dots to mean a smaller concentration. I'm sorry, the blue dots mean a greater concentration of students. The yellow mean a smaller concentration. So you'll see that we have a great deal of students located in the United States, but also some very strong clusters in different regions. You can see along the arm of the Caribbean, and you can see we've got a lot of students. We've got a very high number coming from different parts of Brazil where there are metropolises. We've got a lot in West Africa, particularly in Nigeria, and clusters in Central Eastern Europe as well, plus various groups of students located at major cities around the world. So Walden's international student enrollment, depending on how exactly we're counting and when, it's somewhere around 10 to 12% overall. This percentage may seem like not a lot, but if you look at particular programs, you'll find that some actually have a majority enrollment of international students. So going from course to course within a program, or from program to program within the school, you may find a dramatically different representation. But overall, you will find some international students in every course. We also have a high percentage of non-traditional students. Now, by non-traditional students, I mean students who don't fit the so-called 1960 student college stereotype, meaning they're coming from a more affluent background usually, a very structured education process, and a direct progression from high school into college, and then on through any other degrees. Non-traditional students include adult students who are returning to school later on in life. They include students who have learning disabilities, who would, in a previous era, not have had the advantage of being able to go to a university. It includes international and immigrants, and who might otherwise have not been able to access this. And because Walden University is an open access university with a global reach, we get large percentages of each. And along with that, a high percentage of first-generation students, students who are the first people in their family to go to college, which is something that has very significant ramifications in terms of who they can ask for help within their family, the way that they're able to tap into social networks and collective knowledge about things, as well as the traditions that they've grown up with. which may not have the habits particularly directed and honed towards the education that they're engaged in. We also generally find that our students skew older than the than average for a U.S.-based institution, and this is particularly true with our international students, who are generally 10 to 20 years older than our domestic students, who are mostly in their 30s. So what does this all mean? Well, in short, our students come from a very, very diverse set of backgrounds, whether talking about the culture that they grew up with, the age group, where they're located, what time of day they can access the class, whether this is something in a direct progression of education or this is something where they're coming back to their education later on, the vocabulary that they use, the linguistic variety of which they're accustomed, these are all things that can and frequently do influence how they approach the coursework, the expectations, and the tools that they have at their disposal. So our students in general at Walden, and international students in particular, often come here with different educations that have, in and of themselves, created different expectations about writing, both in what's expected of them and what they expect that we will provide. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a brief moment, but let me talk for a moment about this magnificently titled book here, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English. English is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult languages to learn because we have so many rules stolen from other languages that don't match the other rules and the other words that we've stolen or borrowed from other languages. Also, English tends to take on properties, or local forms of English tend to take on properties of whatever dominant language is nearby. Why does British English have so many French loanwords and French pronunciations? Because right across the channel is their biggest trade partner, France. Why does, for example, Nigerian English tend to take on a different rhythm? Because if you're speaking Hausa, to name just one local language, if you learn Hausa first, you'll tend to speak English following the same grammatical order. The fact that I grew up speaking the same grammatical order as my French-speaking colleagues has a lot to do with my ancestors' proximity to France. Doesn't mean that I can say that my English is perfect, that my English is the best, but it does mean that I can say, so in the particular environment that I am, the English that I speak is locally correct. This English is very much a global language. It's not homogeneous. It's not like France where there's an official regulatory body that says, this is how it's spelled, this is the law. English evolves and is continuing to evolve, and that is both an advantage and sometimes a source of things that we need to navigate. Some examples. Local dialects of English tend to take on properties of whatever the local dominant language is. This can be grammatical rules, can be the syntax, the order of which things are mentioned. It can create simplified or more advanced forms of conjugations, pronunciations, word forms, and it can lead to loanwords that evolve over time and may be very different in the local context and what they originally meant. Here are some very simple examples of what is locally correct that is not correct elsewhere. So I'm located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If I were to drive a few hours north and cross over into Canada, my spelling the word color with 2 O's and no U would no longer be correct because the British English spellings that is used in the United Kingdom and in Canada puts a U in there. Same thing, what we call outerwear in the U.S., what I would also call trousers or slacks. Well, pants. Pants. Those are something you wear on the outside of the United States. You go shopping for pants in the UK, you're talking something you wear underneath your clothes. This can confuse more than a few tourists. Here's another exhibit. What is this piece of footwear called? And this is one of those points where I'd like to ask those who are in the room here to chime in. What would you call this piece of footwear on the left-hand side of the slide? please go ahead and type in or say out loud.
Flip-flops.
Flip-flops, okay. Well, let's go down the stream here. Flip-flop, you win the prize. If we were in California, this would most definitely be a flip-flop. But if we were in New Zealand, you would call this a Japanese sandal. If we were in the Philippines, we'd call it a rubber. If we were in Hawaii, we'd call it a slipper. And in Australia, we'd call it a thong. Now, if you tell your friends that you want to go shopping with them for any one of these items, and you're in a different country, well, if you said that you wanted to go shopping for thongs in California, when they're expecting you to refer to these as flip-flops, let's just say you'll end up at a different type of store. Same thing in the Philippines. Same thing in Australia. When I lived with a bunch of Australian roommates who voted that I was the one with a bad English accent, and they said, Basil, you should wear thongs more often. I said, oh, thank you for the suggestion. I didn't think we had that relationship. And then they explained, and all was good. But you can see how a seemingly innocuous thing, like the footwear that you have, can create a very complex misconception. So what about American English? Most of our students, after all, are rooted here in the United States. Well, if we just look at this dialect map here, you'll find that there are huge regional variations. There are some areas that have commonalities. The Pacific Northwest is fairly similar to the Upper Midwest, and some stuff in common with Southwestern. But look at those pockets in the middle of Appalachia or in the Ozarks in Louisiana. It's hard to say what American English is when we have so many different forms of it. And where just in, say, the Boston urban core, if you drive 1 hour west into Worcester, you start to get a very different accent. So this is the tip of the iceberg of the problems that some of our students run into. So at this point, we'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourselves. Where are you joining us from? And if you could turn on the whiteboard here, we're setting it up so that you can select the marker off on the left-hand side and just draw on this map and let us know where you are. So here I am up here in the U.S. Go ahead and mark yourself on the map. And again, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you should see a little toolbar that has a cursor. It has a marker. Just select the marker and draw on there. All right. So we are, from the looks of it, mostly in the northern part of the United States, which could mean that for those of us here, what we are saying, the terms that we're using, can all be locally correct. But to our compatriot down in Florida, I'm not sure that if I refer to the place where I park my car, which here in Minnesota I would call a ramp, I'm not sure that you would use the same name for it. Because if we went to Boston, you would say a parking garage, not a ramp. So, all right, let's move on to the next step. So here's where we get to the fundamental problem. If there is no universally conception of English, what can we do? And I'd like to pass the room back to my colleague Jenny at this point.
Thanks, Basil. Yeah, so I will now walk you through a couple of kind of case study examples of what we see in student writing based on coming from some of these differing backgrounds in English language and instruction and educational background. But the question is, if there's no universally correct conception of English, how do we communicate these writing expectations to Walden students? And how do we establish a standard to grade against and not get bogged down in terminology? And here you can see in this first case study, this is actually an example from a Nigerian newspaper. But you can see there's very little here in the author's voice. The period is outside of the quotes. And this type of writing really is reliant on other sources of authority, which is much different than APA. Here you can see the long direct quotes, basic APA errors, and again, that over-reliance on outside sources. In this second example, this is actually writing by a native Tagalog speaker. And you can see here that all of the tenses have been changed to the past tense, which is a combination of a misinterpretation of the APA rule to place the research in the past tense, and it's compounded by a condensed tense system. Not all English tenses are actually distinct tenses in Tagalog. Here you can see the universal past tense that is pushed through this writing sample.
May I comment briefly on those case studies, Jenny?
Yes. Yes, please do.
So one of the things that I see a lot with our international students is where a word that seems very clear and specific to us turns out not to be nearly as specific in either their background or in the language that they learned first or are translating into. So a case like this slide where everything gets turned into past tense and is the kind of interpretation that you also see when you say someone, oh, don't use quotes. And the word quote, which can refer to both the text or to the quotation mark, gets interpreted as, oh, don't use the quotation mark, because in some languages that is the same word for each. So there are a lot of very simple misunderstandings with very large repercussions that come out for these. Back to you.
Yeah, that's correct. I think it points at the need for a much more fundamental discussion of American academic English.
All right, with that said, so going back to the question of, so how do we refer to these things that we're talking about concisely? How do we express to our students what kind of English we are expecting, what the standard is that they'll be graded at? I've coined the term academic American English to refer to this. What is academic American English? Well, first of all, it's an artificial dialect based on scholarly writing in the United States. I say artificial because it's not something that just develops and evolves naturally. It is something that is a deliberate choice to impose rules on the language, to emphasize clarity, to emphasize unambiguous meanings, to be able to communicate to everyone clearly, regardless of the background. That's the goal. So let's break that down. Academic. The academic American English means it's formal, that your writing is evidence-based, and that it shows sources. It's American to indicate that this is patterned after the common usage in the United States and at American colleges and universities. So even though Walden has students around the world, we are rooted and centered in the United States. So we use academic American English. English, of course, being the basic language, the starting point. So this term is intended as a concise way of expressing what's a complex idea. How do you communicate when you're writing at the university? How do you communicate when you're writing your dissertation? How do you communicate when you're writing an article? Or just the assignment that you have to write 2 pages on the theme. It's also intended as a non-judgmental way of expressing the required standard for student writing. I think it's a less productive way to start saying, your English is wrong, versus, so here's the specific way of using English that we are grading you on, and here's how to adapt what you are doing already to meet this set of expectations, which can also include other things like concepts of originality and plagiarism, which are very culturally rooted and may have very different interpretations depending on where someone's background is and what their prior education is. It's also a gateway concept that you can use to explain the contextual expectations that come when you enroll at a US-based university. Now remember that a large portion of our students are coming from first-generation student backgrounds, meaning they're the first in the family to go to college. If you grow up and the tradition is you go to college and you know, oh, I have to do these things to prepare, or when I get there, this is what they mean, then you're already partially enculturated. But if you're not coming from that particular background or not acquiring this knowledge from somewhere else, then there are many implicit things that as a student, you may not realize your professor is expecting or is trying to tell you that you're not realizing means what they think they are conveying. So it's a gateway concept for this idea of how we write in different situations and is driven by that situation and the audience, rather than there being just one universal standard. It also encompasses the most common traits of published scholarly writing in the U.S. It's not particular to APA or Chicago or MLA, but it is compatible with that because it's a way of writing, of expressing ideas as separate from the actual style and formatting that, in our case, is all APA. So collectively, if we use APA with academic American English, we find that they reinforce certain principles that are always helpful for our students to be working on. Clarity of communication, a formal grammar, literalness or lack of hyperbole, let's focus on the facts, and a clear attribution of ideas. Here's a case study. Go ahead and look at this, and then I'll read it out loud. Newman, Lim, and Pineda indicate that use of empirical material could enhance validity and reliability of research. Trombetta, Wagenhofer, and Wysocki note that to a certain extent of an instrument, researchers should improve instrument through repeatability to increase internal consistency to enhance reliability. Further, Trombetta et al. Posit that internal validity verifies integrity, while an external validity establishes outside threat that may affect study. Now, to a native American English speaker, I think this sounds a little bit odd. And there are a couple reasons for that. One of them is the use of tense, using present tense here, rather than the past tense that an APA would use to indicate things that people said and did in the past. But it also has a few other things that stand out, like the lack of or near lack of grammatical articles like and or the that tell us how words are related. Now, coming from having studied a number of languages that don't use these things, I can look at this and say, oh, I think I know what they mean. But that's not the same thing as actually writing it. So let's just fill in the gaps a little bit here. Once we add these little bits in here, a word here, a letter there, then the text makes a whole lot more sense. These authors indicated that using empirical material could enhance validity and reliability of research. These other authors noted that to ascertain the reliability of an instrument, researchers should improve the instrument through repeatability to increase its internal consistency and to enhance its reliability. Now, to someone who learned a language that does not have articles or does not use them in the same way as English, the earlier passage here communicates clearly because they know how to fill in the gaps. So part of what I recommend using academic American English to do is to point out, oh, here are these rules, here are these expectations about how you communicate, and it's not that you can't figure this out or that this wouldn't work in the context that you're studying from, but here writing this paper, this dissertation, or whatever the project is you need to include these connections here to make it explicitly clear. Just one example related to this. So one language that uses articles very differently than English is Persian. The word for apple, sib, S-I-B, is changed into saying the apple just by adding an E at the end. So if you come speaking a language like Persian and then you learn English next, your idea of this word being needed to go before the noun that you're referring to can be entirely foreign and very easy to overlook, especially if you're being taught by someone for whom the local form of English does not require using these articles either. Jenny?
Thanks, Basil. So understanding clarity, referral, and empathy. I think it's important first to understand that what has been submitted is usually a good faith effort. There can be times when you receive maybe pieces of writing from students and you have the sense that maybe what has been submitted isn't the best faith effort, but I think reviewing some of these examples, you can see that there are errors that don't necessarily infer that. Second, to be clear in your responses and expectations. Third, refer the student to additional resources as necessary. And at the end here, we're going to pull up a files pod, and we've got a resources handout with a lot of great resources that both at the Writing Center and beyond. And four, it's important to empathize with the difficulty of writing across language and culture. It can often impact student confidence, which you will see in the student writing. It's not just the over-reliance on other authority sources, but it's often the student's reluctance to state something in their own voice that can lead to unclear writing, passive voice, and some of the examples like what we've seen. Step one, it's important to explain the problem in terms of expectations. So, for example, statements like, in general, follow the sentence order subject, verb, object, so that it's clear who did what. Or statements like, this paragraph is missing a clear topic sentence that lays out what you will be discussing. You dive right into the evidence, which makes it unclear what the evidence is for. So when laying out expectations, you want to do that in terms of understanding that the student may come from an entirely different set of expectations, and that this is a particular style of writing that needs to be learned. And it's this particular, because they're at an American university, the student needs to submit material in American academic English. It's not what they've done is wrong, but the expectation is that. And here's another example. You have a tendency to misuse the semicolon by using it where American academic English would specify using a colon, and providing these kinds of resources can really be useful for the student as well. Basil, if you want to move on here to paragraph check.
So this is actually one that threw me for a loop when I was living in Africa, because I was wondering why people kept on bringing me things that they asked me to correct, and then they'd come back and they hadn't followed the advice that I'd given them about changing the punctuation. And then I went to the library and got some books out and realized that the way that they were using the semicolon was exactly where I would use a colon. And this is a country of 1.3 million people, and here's their whole book industry telling me that I'm wrong. So you have to be aware that there are many different systems, even about the use of a punctuation mark. So one of the things that I developed as a resource for teaching students about how to structure their arguments in academic American English, which answers a lot of questions about, okay, well, what are you expecting me as the writer to tell you? How should I tell it? How does it fit together? Is to just give them a formula, if you will, for writing paragraphs. Start with the topic sentence. It says, okay, here's what you're writing about in the paragraph. Follow that by giving evidence or argumentation that supports the claim that's made in the topic sentence. And part of the reason to break it down like this is to move students who might otherwise be writing pieces that are more opinionated rather than clearly grounded in evidence, to this idea that you are building an argument that collectively the paragraph is supposed to say something that an individual sentence does not. So topic sentence, evidence or argumentation, followed by analysis, where you discuss the evidence and how it connects to your topic. Explaining this is necessary, sometimes with some repetition if you have a claim that needs a lot of support to make convincing, followed by synthesis, where you discuss what all of these things mean when you put together. Somewhere in there, that may be in this paragraph, it may be in the next one, you need to have a conclusion or transition where you finish this discussion, talk about what it means collectively or how it connects to the next part of your argument. And this is something I call the no tears plan, because if you follow all these steps, you should have nothing omitted. You should have the topic, sentence, evidence, analysis, repetition of these leading to the synthesis. This link is hot. When you get the slides, you can just click on it, but you can also find it in the PDF handout that's available for download. So this is something I developed and tested at a number of universities, including Walden, and I found great results with my students coming back and saying, oh, well, now that I know how this is supposed to all fit together, it's so much faster to write. And I know, oh, I left out the E, so I need to go find a source that supports this. You can also give a model. I won't read this here for reasons of time, but it's a great exercise to give your students something like the no tears plan and say, all right, go look at this text, analyze it, tell me where each of these parts are, to get them thinking about, oh, this is why this information goes here. This is why this is structured in this way. And then by giving them exercises like this and referring them to go to do things like attend webinars on particular topics, you can both reinforce what you've told them, reinforce what they're hopefully practicing, but also give them opportunities to ask questions. One of the advantages and disadvantages of the asynchronous online learning that we do is that some students will ask questions more freely because they're not having to voice them aloud in real time, and some students will, contrarily, not ask questions as freely. So putting them in an environment like a webinar where they can type the response, in some webinars voice it aloud, or come back with questions and spurred by these, gives them an opportunity to ask questions that aren't otherwise getting covered in just the weekly discussion board or in the emails that follow you're returning a paper. I strongly recommend explaining things early and following up regularly. In my own courses on the discussion board, I usually will front load this, and I'm most active in the first couple weeks to give explanations and comments and feedback so that not just one student, but the whole class is seeing this input and able to use that even if they don't realize that they're doing this consciously. Sometimes you'll have a student where communications just don't seem to be working out with email. You're not sure what's going on. You're not sure if they're understanding you. In those cases, I recommend scheduling a phone call, and I try to do conference calls with my students to be able to point out issues and solutions without putting students on the spot, because writing can be very personal, and if you feel that your writing is under attack because someone's always talking about what you need to do better, well, having a more general discussion that's not specifically aimed at you can be much more effective. And I also like to refer my students to specific Writing Center webinars because it comes with the weight of the personal recommendation, and if they're able to make it live, in general, people pay more attention to something that's actually taking place versus a recording where you might start browsing on Facebook, you might start listening to something else or watching TV as you go. Live has a way of helping focus attention. This one here, Jenny, please feel free to jump in. I think that a lot of students, especially if they are the first in their family, or they're coming from another cultural tradition and feel like their background doesn't align with what they're doing now or hasn't prepared them, or it's just plain different. They can feel a lot of stigma about their writing or stigma about asking questions. And there's some things that, there's some simple steps that I think really help to smooth this over. Do you want to chime in, Jenny?
Sure. Some things that help are acknowledging the student's task and English inconsistencies, so really humanizing the student, referring to personal experiences and intercultural communication, emphasizing support structures as added value, and really emphasizing the importance of clarity versus elegance. What we see really commonly as a common error is a sort of overwritten flowery language, which can either be a stylistic convention from something other than American academic English, or it can be sort of an overcompensation for a lack of confidence. And I've found that that's something that from a human perspective, really humanizing the student and talking them through that on a fundamental level can really help. They often have a fairly significant psychological barrier to writing things simply. There's that sense that it's not intelligent sounding. So that's a point that I've found really useful in providing feedback. And a couple examples are to, again, refer students to webinars, and to empathize with the student and let them know that the mistakes specifically and how they link to APA and the specific style of writing.
Closing comment on those last things that we were discussing. So the point about clarity versus elegance. A well-written article is a wonderful thing. The ideas all flow. It just sounds beautiful. But we're not making our students, at least at this point in their education, write that kind of thing where this is showing decades of experience doing it. Prose can communicate clearly and convincingly without sounding like a master essay. And I think a lot of students do get hung up. I had one student who told me that they kept on rewriting their dissertation, and because they wanted to sound just right. And they'd spent 3 years on that after the content was all done. And in the context of writing your doctoral dissertation, while it's always a good thing to have elegant prose, it's not actually what's required here. So my best wish was that someone had come in years earlier and said, oh, you know, what you've written is actually great. It does everything it needs to now, on to the next step. And if your models are all professional published works, as a student, you may not realize, oh, what I'm doing doesn't have to be this complex. By following this simple grammatical form, I can write something that doesn't take all these words. It doesn't need all these extra adjectives. It doesn't read like a thesaurus. So, at this point,
if I can interject, something, Basil, I'm sorry. One other point about that, something I often emphasize with my students or students I'm working with, is that complex ideas often require simplicity. And that's something that sometimes connects as well.
Thank you. So we did save some time for discussions because we are very interested in hearing from you. What are some strategies that you've used that you find helpful? What are some problems that you've run into? Are there things that you'd like us to talk about in greater detail? While that's ruminating, I do want to plug a couple things. So we are doing a second offering of this on May 4th. So if you came to the session and you would love to refer other people in your program, please do. The more the merrier. If you came a little bit late, well, you'll be getting a link to the recording, but you can also catch us live, especially if you have a question that you discover after your hang-up that you really wish you'd asked. And we do have a partner session and about doctoral dissertation writing that's running on May 6th and May 11th. Jenny, would you like to say anything about the upcoming International Students Conference that the Academic Skills Center is doing?
I believe that we have a link to that. Did you receive that, Basil?
Yeah, I just shared it in the chat room.
Okay,
yep, I just shared it in the chat. So this is the first inaugural International Student Success Conference at Walden. It's hosted by the Academic Skills Center, entirely online, entirely free. Registration is going out tomorrow, so all students and faculty will be receiving an email for that, and it should be great. We're going to have presentations by Academic Advising and a number of other groups. And as a Sorry, Connect just crashed on me. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, I'll have to ask you to give us a link to the multilingual student page while I reconnect.
Sure.
I also want to plug the work of our co-coordinators at the Writing Center, the co-coordinators for international and multilingual student support. This is Dana Harrington and Amy Lindquist, who have put together a fantastic page about different resources to use with international students and supporting international students. So the page that Jenny is giving you the link for is a page that has all these different resources that are constantly expanding, things about grammar, things about different conventions, about navigating the cultural transition, and that's constantly expanding. I just give you a link down there. They do a number of faculty training webinars as well that you can find more information about in the faculty toolbox, and we have a link for those in the handout that's available in the pod in the lower right-hand corner. Let's see. Is there anything that anyone would like to ask about, to share, or to request that we talk about more in our remaining 10 minutes? Craig, so you've raised your hand. Is there anything you'd like to say to the group?
Actually, I raised my hand by mistake there, so sorry about that.
That's all right.
No, I'm good. I bring about 18 years, really, online course development and working with students, primarily, though, here in the United States and with, American English. So just more recently at another institution, because I'm new to Walden, we started to have a lot more international students. And what I noticed with just about all the things you were pointing out in terms of differences, as well as since we'd have verbal dialogues, which is a little different topic than what you're dealing with here in terms of writing, but the understanding, spoken word with a very strong accent or dialect was a problem for many of my peers. For some reasons, not so much for me, but I did change my listening to a deeper listening. I'm talking really deep listening, where as compared to the normal deep listening, and it was very difficult. And this is the point maybe overlaps a little bit. It's very challenging rather than difficult. Challenging to hear value preferences in listening to somebody speak English, and you probably have noticed something similar, Basil. So that just gives rise a question to me in terms of reading work by international students as to how to discern and support their value preferences. So,
That's an excellent point. Two related things. For me, one of the biggest openings of my eyes as a teacher was going to live in another country, speak another language, in this case Mauritian Creole, which is similar to French, and to find that my personality seemed to change entirely based on who I was talking to, because it was the language I was less secure on. I'd get very quiet and just try and keep up and understand what was being said and not participate actively. And there was a lot of stuff that I knew that I missed or that I couldn't convey, or couldn't convey as specifically as I wanted. With value preferences, would I be correct in understanding that you're talking about ways of making arguments, or what types of arguments or statements and were of interest or that were emphasized, something like that?
Yeah, that, and then I primarily work with doctoral as a chair or a coaching mentor. So the values would be related then to their dissertation topic and how they would interpret, and then how we would try to get that phrased in terms of the logic that we use in what you're calling the American academic American English. By the way, I really like that term and going to use that, so thank you.
Thanks. So when I was coming up with the term, one of the things I found I had to distinguish is that one language does not function the same way everywhere. And since my second language is French, if you read a French-Canadian journal, they tend to come in one of two styles. There's academic Canadian French, which is more or less like academic American English, but written in French. And then there's academic metropolitan French, or European French, where there's a just different set of assumptions and expectations in terms of what you tell your reader. I would say that academic American English tends to be more explicit and spells out all the logic and reasoning. And if you are looking at through another system, you might find that there's expectation that you wouldn't insult your reader by spelling out all the steps, because any reasonably intelligent person who knows about this topic will know what you're referring to. And navigating that kind of difference, I think, expresses itself in other areas as well, including a student who may feel that the case is clear, there's a need for this, and thus not use all the steps for spelling out exactly why this is relevant to whom, what the implications are, and other things like that that we try and codify in the dissertation and doctoral study rubrics. So yes, it's very much a concern everywhere. Is there anything else that anyone would like to say or invite further discussion of? Okay. Well, let me turn to the last slides then. Actually, Jenny, could you advance this to the very last slide? So if you have any questions about this presentation or the content of it, please feel free to send us emails. Jenny and I are both on staff at Walden, so you don't have to worry too much about if we're taking a break that semester in teaching. We're here year-round. And we're happy to expand if you have questions about any of the data that we've presented. Please feel free to ask, and we're happy to share. We are all here to help our students do better and to learn better in their studies and go off and do great things. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I think we have a little bit of housekeeping before we wrap up for good.
Yes, thank you, Basil, Jenny. Excellent presentation. We appreciate your information. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will get a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint slideshow, as well as the handout that is right now available at the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. And please take a moment to please fill out the survey. That will come up as soon as I close out this meeting. It will pop up on your screen. If you take a moment to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. Once again, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.